In a San Francisco federal courtroom, a dead man was about to reveal himself. Julian Bennett had lived 3 years under witness protection, hiding with his daughter in Portland. When he discovered his sister Amelia had declared him legally dead and collected $500,000 in life insurance to save their family restaurant, Julian faced an impossible choice. His appearance at her fraud trial would expose the truth but destroy the safety he'd built. What began as family betrayal would become a reckoning that changed everything for the Bennetts forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Morning light filtered through the blinds of their small Portland apartment, casting shadows across Julian's desk, where he sat with his laptop. Grace knelt beside him on the hardwood floor, surrounded by construction paper, markers, and the earnest concentration only a 4-year-old could bring to a school project. "Daddy, what's a family tree?" Grace asked, holding up her worksheet. The assignment was simple. Draw your family tree, include grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. For most children, it would be delightful exploration. For Julian Bennett, living as James Wilson for 3 years, it was a minefield. "It's like a picture showing how families connect," Julian explained carefully, fingers pausing over his keyboard where he'd been reviewing a client's logo design. "Like how you're connected to me." Grace tilted her head, dark hair falling across her forehead. "But what about your mommy and daddy? Don't I have grandparents?" The question hit like it always did. A sharp reminder of everything he'd taken from her in his quest for safety. "They're not around anymore, sweetheart." "Did they die?" Julian's throat tightened. His parents had died 2 years ago in a car accident, according to the obituary he'd found during carefully controlled searches. But he hadn't been there. Hadn't known until months later. Yes, they did. What were their names? He found himself typing without thinking, muscle memory guiding his fingers. David Emery Bennett. The words slipped out. His real surname spoken aloud for the first time in years. Grace brightened. "Bennett, like the knight in my book?" She began drawing stick figures. "What about brothers and sisters?" Julian stared at his screen, where search results were populating. He'd meant to search for something safe. Instead, his treacherous fingers had typed, "David and Marie Bennett obituary, San Francisco." There it was. But below it, something that made his blood freeze. Julian Bennett obituary. His hands trembled as he clicked. The page loaded slowly, each second stretching. When it appeared, he read his own death notice, dated 6 months after his parents' funeral. Cause of death? Drowning. Body never recovered. Survived by his loving sister, Amelia Bennett. "Daddy? You look funny." Grace's voice seemed distant. Julian forced himself to focus on her trusting brown eyes, those innocent of the chaos erupting in their world. "I'm fine, baby. Let me look at something." His fingers moved with practiced efficiency. Opening tabs, diving deeper. The death certificate was filed with proper authorities. His life insurance, $500,000 through his old company, had been claimed. Beneficiary, Amelia Bennett. The apartment felt smaller, walls pressing in. 3 years. For 3 years, his sister had believed him dead. Or had she? Julian's marketing background had taught him to follow digital trails. Within an hour, he'd painted a devastating picture. The Bennett family restaurant, their parents' pride, had been hemorrhaging money. The insurance payout had arrived just in time to prevent bankruptcy. Grace had moved to the couch, family tree abandoned for cartoons. Julian watched her, this beautiful child who bore his features but had never met his family. She hummed along, unaware her father was discovering his own resurrection. He opened his encrypted communication app and typed to Detective Ray Morrison, one of the few from his old life who knew he was alive. "Need to verify something. Death certificate filing in SF? Julian Bennett, 6 months ago."
Response came quickly. Jesus, Julian, you're supposed to be deep cover. What's going on? Just need confirmation. Longer pause. Certificates real. Filed by sister. Insurance paid out. Why are you asking about your own death? Julian stared at the message, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Amelia had declared him dead. Collected $500,000. Used his memory to save their parents' restaurant. His phone buzzed. Julian, be careful. If someone's using your identity. But Julian had moved beyond that concern. The betrayal cut deep, but underneath was something else. Something that made his protective instincts regarding Grace war with a hunger for justice he hadn't felt in years. Grace looked over. Daddy, can we finish my family tree later? I want to draw you and me first. Of course, sweetheart. But as Julian closed his laptop, he knew their quiet Portland life was ending. Somewhere in San Francisco, his sister lived with money from his death. Their parents' restaurant served customers with funds from his supposed drowning. And Grace, innocent, trusting Grace, was asking questions about family Julian couldn't answer without destroying their safety. The afternoon sun shifted, throwing new shadows. Julian watched Grace color, small hands steady as she drew their simple family of two. She had no idea that in California, she had an aunt who believed her father was dead, an uncle who'd helped forge documents, a great-uncle who'd probably helped pay for Julian's funeral. His phone buzzed. Ray, if you're thinking of doing something, don't. Your ex-wife's people are still looking. Julian deleted the message. His ex-wife, Victoria, and her family's criminal connections were why he'd disappeared, why Grace had never known security beyond their guarded Portland life. But Amelia had given him perfect cover. He was already dead. His sister had ensured that. The question was whether Julian Bennett was ready to rise from the grave for justice, family, truth, or if James Wilson would continue protecting their quiet life built from his former existence's ashes. Grace held up her drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright sun.
Look, Daddy, it's us. Julian smiled, but his mind was already working, planning, deciding that some secrets were too dangerous to keep, some betrayals too deep to ignore. The afternoon stretched ahead, deceptively peaceful. But Julian knew that peace was illusion, as fragile as the false identity that had protected them for 3 years. The afternoon stretched ahead, deceptively peaceful. Julian stared at Grace's drawing, 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright sun, but his mind was already working, already planning. The innocent artwork felt like a reproach, a reminder of the simple life he was about to complicate. After Grace fell asleep that evening, Julian returned to his laptop with the methodical focus that had once made him successful in marketing. But this wasn't about selling products. This was about understanding the sister who had sold his death. He started with social media, creating a carefully crafted fake profile. Marcus Chen, a food blogger from Seattle interested in family-owned restaurants. The identity felt solid enough to pass casual scrutiny while giving him access to Amelia's world. Finding her wasn't difficult. Amelia Bennett ran the social media for Bennett's Kitchen with the same passionate intensity she'd brought to everything as a child. Her posts painted a picture of desperate optimism, photos of steaming dim sum, heartfelt stories about their parents' immigrant journey, carefully worded pleas for community support during these difficult times. But it was the memorial posts about him that made Julian's hands shake. 2 years ago today, we lost my beloved brother Julian, read a post from 6 months ago, accompanied by a photo Julian barely remembered. Him and Amelia at their parents' anniversary dinner, both smiling, both believing their family was unbreakable. He was the dreamer in our family, always believing in new possibilities. I know he would want us to keep fighting for what our parents built. The comments below were filled with condolences, promises to visit the restaurant, expressions of support for poor Amelia's loss. Each response felt like dirt being thrown on his coffin. Julian scrolled through months of posts, watching his sister construct a narrative of grief and determination. She visited their parents' grave every Sunday, posting photos of fresh flowers and handwritten notes. She spoke at community events about preserving family legacies. She had turned his supposed death into a rallying cry for the restaurant's survival. The manipulation was sophisticated, but underneath it, Julian recognized something else: genuine pain. Amelia's grief wasn't entirely fabricated. Their parents' death had devastated her, and his disappearance, his choice to vanish without explanation, had left her truly alone. His marketing instincts kicked in as he analyzed her digital footprint. The restaurant's finances were worse than he had initially thought. Suppliers demanding payment, landlord threatening eviction, staff leaving for more stable employment. The insurance money hadn't just been a windfall, it had been a lifeline. Julian shifted his focus to public records, using skills he'd developed during his own identity transformation. Property taxes, business licenses, court filings, the digital trail of a family business in crisis. That's where he found Isaac Bennett's name for the first time, Amelia's husband, married 8 months ago in a small ceremony that Julian had missed because he was officially dead. Isaac worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of steady man their parents would have approved of. His signature appeared on several business documents for the restaurant, including the insurance claim. Julian dug deeper into Isaac's background, finding a man with no criminal history, no red flags, just an ordinary person who had somehow become complicit in fraud. The documents showed Isaac's professional knowledge of financial systems had been essential to making Julian's death appear legitimate. A new player entered Julian's research when he discovered correspondence between the insurance company and Bennett's kitchen. Nora Valdez, senior investigator, Pacific Coast Insurance. Her name appeared on several official letters requesting additional documentation about Julian's death. Julian's blood chilled if he read between the lines. Valdez was asking pointed questions. Where was the body? Why had no one reported Julian missing before his death? Why were there no witnesses to his supposed drowning? Someone was investigating. The carefully constructed lie was already beginning to unravel. Julian's fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing urgency. He accessed news archives, professional networks, anything that could tell him about Nora Valdez, 20-year veteran of financial crimes investigation, specialized in insurance fraud, recently reassigned from Los Angeles after successfully prosecuting a family-based embezzlement case. The parallels weren't lost on him. Valdez had experience with families that destroyed themselves through betrayal. As midnight approached, Julian found himself staring at a photo from Amelia's latest post. She stood in Bennett's kitchen, surrounded by customers, her smile bright but tired. The caption read, "Grateful for this community that has become our extended family. Mom and Dad would be so proud of how we've all come together."
For the first time since discovering his death certificate, Julian felt something other than anger. Looking at his sister's face, older than he remembered, marked by stress and grief, he saw the weight she carried. She wasn't just a thief who had stolen his identity. She was a woman desperately trying to honor their parents' memory while drowning in circumstances beyond her control. But understanding didn't eliminate the fundamental problem. Amelia had committed fraud using his identity, and now an investigator was closing in. Julian's carefully protected life in Portland existed because he was legally dead. If Valdez's investigation exposed the truth, it wouldn't just destroy Amelia, it would destroy his cover and put Grace in danger. Julian closed his laptop as dawn light crept through the blinds. Grace would wake soon, expecting breakfast and help with her family tree project. She would ask more innocent questions about relatives she'd never meet, never knowing that her aunt was fighting for survival using her father's stolen death. The methodical investigation had given Julian what he needed, a complete picture of Amelia's situation, but it had also given him something he hadn't expected: the realization that his sister wasn't a villain, but a victim of circumstances that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Now he faced an impossible choice: remain dead and let justice take its course, or emerge from the shadows to save the sister who had already mourned him twice. The afternoon stretched ahead, deceptively peaceful. Julian stared at Grace's drawing, two stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. But his mind was already working, already planning. The innocent artwork felt like a reproach, a reminder of the simple life he was about to complicate. After Grace fell asleep that evening, Julian returned to his laptop with the methodical focus that had once made him successful in marketing. But this wasn't about selling products. This was about understanding the sister who had sold his death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He started with social media, creating a carefully crafted fake profile. Marcus Chen, a food blogger from Seattle, interested in family-owned restaurants. The identity felt solid enough to pass casual scrutiny while giving him access to Amelia's world. Finding her wasn't difficult. Amelia Bennett ran the social media for Bennett's Kitchen with the same passionate intensity she'd brought to everything as a child. Her posts painted a picture of desperate optimism. Photos of steaming dim sum, heartfelt stories about their parents' immigrant journey, carefully worded pleas for community support during these difficult times. But it was the memorial posts about him that Julian's hands shook. 2 years ago today, we lost my beloved brother Julian, read a post from 6 months ago, accompanied by a photo Julian barely remembered, him and Amelia at their parents' anniversary dinner, both smiling, both believing their family was unbreakable. He was the dreamer in our family, always believing in new possibilities. I know he would want us to keep fighting for what our parents built. The comments below were filled with condolences, promises to visit the restaurant, expressions of support for poor Amelia's loss. Each response felt like dirt being thrown on his coffin. Julian scrolled through months of posts, watching his sister construct a narrative of grief and determination. She visited their parents' grave every Sunday, posting photos of fresh flowers and handwritten notes. She spoke at community events about preserving family legacies. She had turned his supposed death into a rallying cry for the restaurant's survival. The manipulation was sophisticated, but underneath it, Julian recognized something else: genuine pain. Amelia's grief wasn't entirely fabricated. Their parents' death had devastated her, and his disappearance, his choice to vanish without an explanation, had left her truly alone. His marketing instincts kicked in as he analyzed her digital footprint. The restaurant's finances were worse than he had initially thought. Suppliers demanding payment, landlord threatening eviction, staff leaving for more stable employment. The insurance money hadn't just been a windfall, it had been a lifeline. Julian shifted his focus to public records, using skills he developed during his own identity transformation. Property taxes, business licenses, court filings, the digital trail of a family business in crisis. That's where he found Isaac Bennett's name for the first time, Amelia's husband, married 8 months ago in a small ceremony that Julian had missed because he was officially dead. Isaac worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown, the kind of steady man their parents would have approved of. His signature appeared on several business documents for the restaurant, including the insurance claim. Julian dug deeper into Isaac's background, finding a man with no criminal history, no red flags, just an ordinary person who had somehow become complicit in fraud. The documents showed Isaac's professional knowledge of financial systems had been essential to making Julian's death appear legitimate. A new player entered Julian's research when he discovered correspondence between the insurance company and Bennett's Kitchen. Nora Valdez, senior investigator, Pacific Coast Insurance. Her name appeared on several official letters requesting additional documentation about Julian's death. Julian's blood chilled as he read between the lines. Valdez was asking pointed questions. Where was the body? Why had no one reported Julian missing before his death? Why were there no witnesses to his supposed drowning? Someone was investigating. The carefully constructed lie was already beginning to unravel. Julian's fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing urgency. He accessed news archives, professional networks, anything that could tell him about Nora Valdez.
Specialized in insurance fraud, recently reassigned from Los Angeles after successfully prosecuting a family-based embezzlement case. The parallels weren't lost on him. Valdez had experience with families that destroyed themselves through betrayal. As midnight approached, Julian found himself staring at a photo from Amelia's latest post. She stood in Bennett's kitchen, surrounded by customers, her smile bright but tired. The caption read, "Grateful for this community that has become our extended family. Mom and Dad would be so proud of how we've all come together." For the first time since discovering his death certificate, Julian felt something other than anger. Looking at his sister's face, older than he remembered, marked by stress and grief, he saw the weight she carried. She wasn't just a thief who had stolen his identity, she was a woman desperately trying to honor their parents' memory while drowning in circumstances beyond her control. But understanding didn't eliminate the fundamental problem. Amelia had committed fraud using his identity, and now an investigator was closing in. Julian's carefully protected life in Portland existed because he was legally dead. If Valdez's investigation exposed the truth, it wouldn't just destroy Amelia, it would destroy his cover and put Grace in danger. Julian closed his laptop as dawn light crept through the blinds. Grace would wake soon, expecting breakfast and help with her family tree project. She would ask more innocent questions about relatives she'd never meet, never knowing that her aunt was fighting for survival using her father's stolen death. The methodical investigation had given Julian what he needed, a complete picture of Amelia's situation. But it had also given him something he hadn't expected, the realization that his sister wasn't a villain, but a victim of circumstances that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. Now he faced an impossible choice: remain dead and let justice take its course, or emerge from the shadows to save the sister who had already mourned him twice. Julian closed his laptop as dawn light crept through the blinds, but sleep didn't come. Instead, he found himself standing at the kitchen window, watching Portland wake up while his mind churned through impossible calculations. Grace would wake soon, expecting breakfast and normalcy, never knowing that 300 miles south, her aunt was about to face the consequences of declaring her father dead. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended animation. Julian maintained his routine: client calls, school pickup, bedtime stories, while obsessively monitoring the digital threads connecting him to his former life. What he discovered made his stomach clench with each new development. Nora Valdez wasn't just investigating, she was systematically dismantling Amelia's story. Through his fake social media profile, Julian watched as the investigators' visits to San Francisco became a pattern. She interviewed former customers of Bennett's kitchen, asking pointed questions about Julian's disappearance. She spoke with neighbors, with suppliers, with anyone who might have known the Bennett family. But it was Margaret Bennett, no relation despite the shared surname, who provided the crack that would split Amelia's carefully constructed narrative wide open. Julian discovered the interview through a local news blog that covered the investigation. Margaret, 72 and sharp as ever, had been a fixture at Bennett's kitchen since Julian's childhood. She remembered him as a boy, remembered his marketing career, remembered his sudden disappearance 3 years ago. Julian was troubled, Margaret told the reporter who had picked up Valdez's story. His marriage was falling apart, and there were problems, dangerous problems. But he wouldn't have just vanished without telling his family. And when Amelia said he drowned, Margaret's voice carried decades of skepticism. Where was the funeral? Where was the body? You don't just accept that someone is gone without proof. Julian's hands trembled as he read Margaret's words. This woman had known him since childhood, had watched him grow up in the restaurant's kitchen. Her suspicions weren't based on investigation or evidence, they were based on love and the intimate knowledge that came from watching someone's character develop over years. Meanwhile, cracks were appearing in Amelia's alliance with Isaac. Julian's surveillance,
conducted through carefully orchestrated digital observation and public records, revealed a pattern of stress that was pushing Isaac toward a breakdown. It started with small signs. Isaac's LinkedIn profile showed increasingly erratic activity. His work colleagues began commenting on his distraction, his uncharacteristic mistakes, and financial reports. Julian found evidence of Isaac's growing alcohol purchases through credit card activity that appeared in court documents related to the insurance investigation. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. Julian was tracking Isaac's social media activity when posts began appearing from Isaac's work colleagues expressing concern. Apparently, Isaac had suffered what HR diplomatically called a stress-related incident during a client meeting. Julian's encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Ray Morrison. "Your sister's husband just tried to confess insurance fraud to his priest. Father McCarty called it in as a welfare check. SFPD is aware." The walls were closing in from every direction, and Julian could see it happening in real time through his digital monitoring. Amelia's social media posts became increasingly defensive, her photos forced rather than natural. The restaurant's community support was wavering as news of the investigation spread. Then came the moment Julian had dreaded. Amelia discovered she was being investigated. Through his fake profile, Julian watched as Amelia posted a carefully worded statement about false allegations and harassment of a grieving family. But behind the public face, Julian's surveillance revealed panic.
Amelia had contacted 3 different law firms in 2 days. Her phone records, accessible through court filings, showed increasingly frantic calls to Isaac, to Uncle Leonard, to anyone who might help her navigate the legal storm approaching. Uncle Leonard's response was immediate and heartbreaking. Within hours of Amelia's call, he had offered to mortgage his own property to pay for her legal defense. His public statement to the media was fierce in its loyalty. "The Bennett family has given everything to this community. Amelia is an honest woman trying to honor her parents' memory. These accusations are an insult to their legacy." Julian stared at his uncle's words, feeling the weight of family loyalty that had once protected him, now turned against truth itself. Leonard didn't know about the fraud, didn't know that his fierce defense was enabling a lie that could destroy them all. But the most devastating moment came when Julian watched Isaac and Amelia fight through a restaurant security camera he'd managed to access. The audio was poor, but their body language told the story. Isaac gesturing desperately, Amelia shaking her head, both of them trapped in a web of lies that was tightening around them. Julian could see Isaac's guilt eating at him, could see Amelia's determination crumbling under pressure. His sister, the girl who had once believed she could save the world through sheer force of will, was watching her world collapse because she had tried to save their parents' restaurant using his stolen death. As he closed his laptop that night, Julian realized the investigation had moved beyond his control. Valdez was too thorough, Isaac too guilt-ridden, Margaret too perceptive. The truth was going to come out whether he acted or not. The question was no longer whether to reveal himself, but when and whether he could do it in a way that protected Grace while ensuring justice was served. Outside, Portland slept peacefully, unaware that across the city, a dead man was planning his resurrection.
His absence wasn't immediately recognized as permanent. Julian watched Amelia during the press conference, studying his sister's face with the intensity of someone reading his own obituary. She looked smaller than he remembered, worn down by stress and grief. When she spoke, brief, carefully coached statements about honoring their parents' legacy, her voice carried genuine emotion. "My brother believed in second chances," Amelia said, looking directly into the camera. "He believed that families should fight for what matters. That's what I'm doing, fighting for what he and our parents built together." The words were devastating in their partial truth. Julian had believed in second chances. It's why he'd given himself one by disappearing. He had believed families should fight for what matters. It's why he sacrificed everything to protect Grace. But watching Park's masterful manipulation of narrative, Julian felt something shift inside him. His sister wasn't just stealing his identity, she was stealing his story, his character, his choices, and rewriting them to serve her needs. Uncle Leonard appeared at the press conference's end, his presence adding gravitas to Amelia's defense. The Bennett family has served this community for 30 years, Leonard said, his voice carrying the authority of a successful immigration lawyer. We came here with nothing, built something beautiful, and now we're watching it be torn down by bureaucrats who never understood what it means to sacrifice for family. Julian's phone buzzed with updates from his automated monitoring systems. The press conference was being picked up by local news stations, sympathetic blog posts were already appearing, and social media was rallying around the grieving sister narrative. But underneath the public relations victory, Julian could see cracks forming. Nora Valdez had not attended the press conference, which suggested she was confident in her investigation. More troubling, Isaac had been notably absent from the family show of solidarity. That evening, as Julian helped Grace with her homework, she looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes and asked, "Daddy, do you think we'll ever have more family?" The innocent question shattered something inside Julian. He had spent 3 years protecting Grace from the dangers of his past, but he had also protected her from love, from the messy complexity of extended family, from the very connections that make life rich and meaningful. "Maybe someday, sweetheart," he said, knowing that someday might come sooner than either of them was prepared for. As Grace colored her simplified family tree, just 2 figures holding hands, Julian made a decision that had been building since he first discovered his own death certificate. Park's press conference had shown him how the truth could be manipulated, how his own story could be rewritten by others. If Amelia was going to use his memory to save herself, perhaps it was time for Julian Bennett to reclaim his own narrative.
Marie Bennett never believed Julian was dead. She told me so, right before her own accident. "Margaret," she said, "my son is out there somewhere, and someday he'll come home." Julian had to leave the room, his throat too tight to breathe. His mother had known. Despite the official story, despite the lack of contact, she had carried the faith that he was alive. That night, Julian sat at his laptop and began typing letters to Nora Valdez. Draft after draft, each one starting differently. "I am writing to inform you that your investigation is correct. Julian Bennett did not die 6 months ago. I have information relevant to the Bennett insurance fraud case." But each letter remained unsent. Every time Julian's finger hovered over the send button, he thought of Grace sleeping down the hall, of the quiet life they'd built, of Victoria and her family's connections that still posed a threat. Meanwhile, Isaac's guilt was destroying him in real time. Julian's monitoring revealed increasingly erratic behavior. Missed workdays, emergency room visits for panic attacks, a desperate call to St. Mary's Catholic Church requesting urgent confession. The priest's welfare call to police hadn't resulted in charges, but Julian could see Isaac cracking under pressure. His social media posts became incoherent rambles about guilt and forgiveness. His credit card showed purchases of increasing amounts of alcohol. Amelia's posts, by contrast, became more defiant. She organized community events at the restaurant, posted photos of loyal customers, shared stories about their parents' immigrant journey. She was fighting the charges by leaning into the narrative Park had created, the devoted sister preserving family legacy against corporate persecution. But Julian could see the strain in her photos, the forced smiles, the shadows under her eyes, the way she held herself as if expecting another blow. His sister was drowning in the lies she'd created, and Julian held the only lifeline. Uncle Leonard's mortgage went through, the local paper running a sympathetic story about family solidarity in the face of injustice. Community leaders rallied around Amelia, and a legal defense fund surpassed its goal within days. Julian found himself trapped between competing loyalties to the truth, to his sister, to Grace's safety, to his own survival. Every day he delayed action, the case gained momentum in a direction that would make his eventual revelation more catastrophic. 3 weeks after the indictment, Julian was pacing his living room, dictating another unsent letter to Valdez, when Grace appeared in the doorway. "Daddy, who's Amelia?" Julian froze. "What? You keep saying that name when you're walking around. Amelia. And you said something about Bennett's Kitchen. Is that like the restaurant we saw on TV? The one with the sad lady?" Julian stared at his daughter, realizing that his careful compartmentalization had been failing. His obsession with the case had leaked into their daily life in ways he hadn't noticed. Grace's next question cut straight through his defenses. "Daddy? Is Bennett our real last name? Like your mommy and daddy that died?" The moment Julian had been dreading since discovering his own death certificate had finally arrived. His 4-year-old daughter, with the piercing logic that children possessed, had connected dots he thought he'd kept separate. Standing in his Portland living room, faced with Grace's trusting eyes and impossible questions, Julian realized that his choice was no longer between revealing himself or staying hidden. It was between lying to his daughter or telling her a truth that would change everything. "Daddy?" Grace's voice was smaller now, uncertain in the way that only children could be when they sensed the ground shifting beneath them. "Are you okay? You look scared." Julian kneeled down to her level, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. 4 years of careful lies had led to this moment, and he could feel the weight of every fabricated story, every deflected question, every time he had chosen safety over honesty. "Bennett was my name before," he said quietly.
Before we became the Wilsons. Grace's forehead wrinkled in concentration. But why did we change it? The question hung between them like a bridge Julian could either cross or burn down. He had spent 3 years protecting Grace from the complexity of their situation, but now he realized that protection had become its own form of prison. "Sometimes people have to start over," Julian began, choosing his words with surgical precision. "Sometimes the place where you lived becomes dangerous, and you have to find a new place to be safe. Like when the mean kids at school made Emma switch classes?" Julian's heart clenched at the simplicity of her comparison. "Sort of like that, but bigger. And the danger wasn't just for me, it was for you too, even though you weren't born yet." Grace absorbed this information with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, but her next question cut deeper. "What about your sister? The lady on TV. Is she really your sister?" Julian felt the last of his carefully constructed barriers crumble. "Yes. Her name is Amelia, and she's your aunt." "Do I have other family too? Like the uncle that man talked about?" "Yes." The word felt like stepping off a cliff. "You have Uncle Leonard, who's actually your great-uncle. And there was Margaret, who isn't really family but was like a grandmother to me and Amelia when we were growing up." Grace's eyes widened with wonder that comes from discovering a world that had been hidden from view. "Why can't we visit them? Don't they want to meet me?" Julian closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of isolation pressing down on both of them. "It's complicated," Julian said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Grace was quiet for a long moment, her small hands playing with the hem of her dress. When she looked up, her expression held a gravity that seemed far too mature for her age. "Are we going to stay Wilsons forever?"
Julian realized he didn't have an answer. For 3 years, the Wilson identity had felt permanent, a necessary shield against threats that still existed. But watching Grace process the revelation of her stolen heritage, he began to understand what his protection had cost her. That evening, after Grace had gone to bed with more questions than answers, Julian found himself staring at his phone. Margaret Bennett's number was easy to find through public records, and before he could second-guess himself, he was dialing. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Julian's throat closed. Margaret's voice carried the same warm authority he remembered from childhood, when she had been a fixture in their restaurant, dispensing wisdom and comfort in equal measure. "Hello? Is anyone there?" He should speak, should identify himself, should end 3 years of silence with the 2 words that would change everything. "It's Julian."
Instead, he hung up. Julian sat in his kitchen, head in his hands, while 300 miles south, his sister's world continued to collapse. His monitoring systems had shown Isaac's deterioration accelerating over the past week. Missed work, emergency room visits, increasingly desperate social media posts about guilt and redemption. The final straw came when Julian's surveillance revealed Isaac drinking at O'Malley's pub on Mission Street, 3 blocks from Bennett's kitchen. The security footage Julian had accessed showed a man on the edge of complete breakdown, crying into his whiskey while muttering what looked like confessions to an empty bar. Amelia appeared in the footage 20 minutes later, her face a mask of controlled fury. Julian couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language told the story. Isaac's guilt-ridden pleading, Amelia's desperate attempts to hold their story together, both of them trapped in a web of lies that was tightening around them with each passing day. Julian watched his sister, this woman he had once known better than anyone, struggled to manage a man whose conscience was destroying their defense. She looked older, harder, worn down by months of maintaining impossible fictions. But underneath the strain, he could still see the girl who had believed she could save their parents' restaurant through sheer force of will. The irony wasn't lost on him. Amelia was fighting to preserve their family's legacy, while Julian had abandoned it entirely. She was using his supposed death to honor their parents' memory, while he had chosen to let them all believe he was gone. Grace's questions echoed in his mind as he closed his laptop. She had asked if they would stay Wilsons forever, but Julian was beginning to realize the more important question was whether he could continue being James Wilson while watching his real family destroy itself in his name. Outside, Portland slept peacefully, unaware that across the city, a dead man was finally beginning to understand that resurrection wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about accepting responsibility for all the truths he had been hiding. Outside, Portland slept peacefully, but Julian hadn't slept in days. The decision crystallized somewhere between Grace's bedtime story and the morning news that showed Amelia entering the federal courthouse in San Francisco. Julian was going to attend his own trial, the trial that would determine whether his sister was guilty of profiting from his death. 2 days later, Julian sat in the back row of courtroom 3B, wearing glasses he didn't need and a beard he'd grown specifically for this moment. His hands shook as he watched Amelia enter with James Park, her lawyer's confident stride contrasting sharply with her uncertain steps. Julian had left Grace with Mrs. Chen next door, claiming a work emergency in Seattle. Another lie in a life built on lies, but this one felt different, final somehow, like the last deception before everything changed. Judge Patricia Williams called the court to order, and Julian found himself studying his sister's profile as she sat at the defendant's table. 3 years had changed her. The confident young woman who used to debate politics with their father had been replaced by someone who held herself carefully, as if expecting attack from any direction.
Assistant District Attorney David Chen, no relation to Julian's neighbor, opened with surgical precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a simple but devastating fraud. The defendant, Amelia Bennett, declared her living brother dead to collect $500,000 in life insurance benefits. She forged documents, lied to investigators, and used family grief to cover her tracks. The defendant will try to convince you this was a grieving sister's mistake, Chen said, his voice carrying quiet authority. But the evidence will show this was a calculated fraud planned and executed with the help of her husband, Isaac Bennett. James Park's opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. He painted Amelia as a daughter overwhelmed by loss, struggling to preserve her parents' immigrant dream while dealing with a brother who had simply vanished from their lives. Julian Bennett was a troubled man, Park told the jury, his voice carrying just the right note of sympathy. His marriage was failing, he was distant from his family. When someone disappears completely from their life, when they cut all contact, when they abandon everything they once held dear, what else is a family to conclude but death? Julian's hands clenched in his lap. Park was using his own protective choices against him, turning his decision to disappear into evidence of suicidal intention. The first witness was Detective Ray Morrison, called by the prosecution to establish that no missing person report had ever been filed for Julian Bennett. Under cross-examination, Park got Ray to admit that Julian was experiencing personal difficulties before his disappearance. Julian watched Ray testify, knowing his old friend was walking a careful line. Ray knew Julian was alive, but couldn't reveal that without destroying both their cases. Margaret Bennett took the stand next, and Julian's breath caught. She looked frailer than she had in her television interview, but her voice carried the same steel he remembered from childhood. "I've known the Bennett family for 40 years, Margaret testified. Julian was like a grandson to me, and I know he didn't drown in that bay." "What makes you so certain?" "Because Julian Bennett was afraid of water. Had been since he nearly drowned at Ocean Beach when he was 12. That boy wouldn't go near the water voluntarily, let alone jump in." Julian felt tears sting his eyes.
Margaret remembered everything, not just the family dynamics and relationships, but the small, crucial details that revealed character. Under Park's cross-examination, Margaret acknowledged that Julian had been troubled in his final months, that his marriage was failing, that he had seemed distant from family. But she never wavered from her central conviction. Julian Bennett was alive somewhere. Uncle Leonard's testimony nearly broke Julian's composure. His uncle took the stand wearing his best suit, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. When asked about Julian's character, Leonard's voice carried decades of family love. "Julian was the dreamer in our family," Leonard testified. "Always believed things could be better, that people deserved second chances. He loved that restaurant because it represented our parents' dreams. If he was alive, he would never have let Amelia struggle alone." The words cut deeper than any accusation. Leonard's faith in Julian's character made his 3-year abandonment feel even more cowardly. But it was Isaac's testimony that revealed how completely their defense was cracking. Julian watched his brother-in-law take the stand, noting the tremor in his hands, the way he avoided looking at Amelia. Isaac confirmed the basic facts: the restaurant's financial troubles, the timing of the insurance claim, his role in filing the paperwork. But under cross-examination, his answers became increasingly erratic. "Mr. Bennett," Chen pressed, "you signed documents declaring Julian Bennett dead. Were you certain he was deceased?" Isaac's voice barely rose above a whisper. Amelia said there was no body, but you had no actual evidence of death, did you?" Isaac glanced desperately at Amelia, then at Park. We needed... Park jumped up with an objection, but the damage was visible. Isaac was cracking, his guilt overwhelming his ability to maintain their story. Julian watched this unfold from his back row seat, realizing that Isaac's conscience was about to destroy everything: Amelia's defense, their marriage, any chance of avoiding prison. His brother-in-law was fundamentally decent, and that decency was incompatible with the lie they'd been living. As court recessed for the day, Julian saw Amelia and Isaac in heated conversation by the defendant's table. Even from across the courtroom, he could read their body language. Isaac's guilt-ridden desperation, Amelia's growing panic as she realized her accomplice was about to confess. Julian left the courthouse knowing he had reached the moment of truth. Tomorrow, Isaac would likely break completely under continued questioning. Amelia would be convicted, Uncle Leonard would lose his house, and the family Julian had abandoned would be destroyed by his own disappearance. Unless Julian Bennett chose to rise from the dead. Julian left the courthouse knowing he had reached the moment of truth. That night, he sat in his Portland apartment, staring at a photo of Grace sleeping peacefully, unaware that her father was about to shatter the careful life they'd built together. He had called Mrs. Chen again, extending his supposed business trip. Another lie, but this one felt different, like the last false word he would ever speak as James Wilson. The next morning, Julian returned to courtroom 3B earlier than before, choosing a seat with a clear view of both the witness stand and the defendant's table. He watched Amelia enter, noting how she clutched Isaac's arm, how her eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, as if expecting ambush from any direction. Isaac looked worse than the day before. His suit was wrinkled, his hands shaking as he fumbled with papers at the defendant's table. Julian could see the weight of guilt literally bowing his shoulders. Judge Williams called the court to order, and ADA Chen approached Isaac with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. Mr. Bennett, yesterday you testified that you helped file insurance documents declaring Julian Bennett dead. I want to focus on the timeline. When exactly did you first become aware that Julian might be dead?
But something about it caught Amelia's attention. She glanced back toward the gallery, and their eyes met across the space of 3 years and countless lies. Julian watched recognition dawn on his sister's face. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp, her hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. "Your Honor," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's stunned silence, "I need to address the court." Judge Williams looked confused. "Sir, this is a closed proceeding. If you have information relevant to this case—" "I do," Julian said, stepping into the aisle. "My name is Julian David Bennett, and I'm very much alive." The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled for phones, the jury turned as one to stare, and court officers moved toward Julian with uncertain authority. Through it all, Julian kept his eyes on Amelia, watching his sister process the impossible reality of his resurrection. "Julian," she whispered, her voice cutting through the chaos. Park was on his feet, shouting objections and motions, while Chen stood frozen with shock. Judge Williams was calling for order, threatening to clear the courtroom. But Julian only saw Amelia, his sister, his betrayer, his victim, his family, staring at him as if he were a ghost made flesh, which, in a way, he was. Isaac collapsed back into his chair, relief and terror warring on his face as the weight of 3 years of lives finally lifted from his shoulders. Julian took another step forward, and with that movement, James Wilson ceased to exist forever. The courtroom chaos swirled around him, reporters shouting questions, court officers conferring in urgent whispers, Judge Williams demanding order with increasingly sharp gavels. But Julian's entire focus remained on Amelia's face.
His sister sat frozen at the defendant's table, her hands still pressed to her throat, staring at him as if he might vanish again at any moment. The 3 years between them collapsed into nothing, and Julian saw the girl who used to wait by the restaurant window for him to come home from school, who had believed her big brother could fix anything. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Judge Williams' voice finally cut through the pandemonium. Mr. Bennett. She paused, uncertainty flickering across her judicial composure. Which Mr. Bennett should I say? The one who's supposedly dead? Or the one who just committed perjury? Isaac had begun laughing, high, hysterical sounds that bordered on sobs. He's alive, he kept repeating to no one in particular. Oh, God, he's alive, and we... Park grabbed his client's arm, whispering urgently in his ear. ADA Chen approached the bench, his prosecutorial confidence replaced by bewilderment. Your Honor, we need to verify this man's identity and determine his status regarding... I can verify myself. I pulled out his driver's license, the James Wilson license that had been his shield for 3 years. I've been living in Portland under witness protection. My real name is Julian David Bennett, born March 15th, 1991, to David and Marie Bennett of San Francisco. Judge Williams studied the license, then looked at Julian with the expression of someone whose orderly world had just been upended. Mr. Bennett, do you understand that your appearance here creates massive legal complications? Your sister has been charged with fraud based on your supposed death. I understand. Julian's voice was steadier than he felt. That's why I'm here. The courtroom fell silent except for the whispered consultations between lawyers and the soft scratch of reporters' pens. Julian could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but the only gaze that mattered was Amelia's. She stood slowly, her lawyer's restraining hand falling away. Julian, her voice broke on his name. Is it really you? For a moment, they were children again. Amelia, 8 years old, waiting for her brother to come home from school. Julian, 12, responsible and protective, promising he would always take care of her. It's me, Amelia. She moved toward him with the uncertain steps of someone walking on unstable ground.
When she reached the gallery rail that separated them, she stopped, her hands gripping the wood. I thought you were dead, she whispered. For 3 years, I thought... Her voice shattered. How could you let me think you were dead? The question hit Julian like a physical blow. In all his calculations about revealing himself, he had focused on the legal implications, the safety concerns, the impact on Grace. He hadn't fully considered the fundamental cruelty of letting his family mourn a death that never happened. I had to disappear, Julian said quietly. Victoria and her family, they were dangerous. I had to protect Grace. Grace? Amelia's eyes widened. You have a daughter? She's 4. She's your niece. Julian watched his sister process this information, seeing her struggle with the revelation that she had an extended family she'd never known existed. The parallel to Grace's own isolation wasn't lost on him. Uncle Leonard had been silent throughout the chaos, but now he stepped forward from the gallery, his face pale with shock and something that might have been anger. Julian? Leonard's voice carried decades of disappointment. We buried an empty coffin. I spoke at your funeral. Your sister has been grieving you for 3 years while fighting to save everything our family built. The accusation in his uncle's tone was worse than any legal consequence Julian might face. Leonard had always been the family's moral center, the one who balanced pragmatism with principle. His judgment felt final. I know, Julian said simply. I know what I took from all of you. Judge Williams interrupted the family reunion with judicial authority. This court is in recess while we sort out these unprecedented circumstances. Mr. Bennett, she looked at Julian, you'll need to be processed by federal marshals. Miss Bennett, her gaze shifted to Amelia, your counsel will need to file immediate motions given this development. As court officers approached, Julian held up his hand. I need to make arrangements for my daughter. She's in Portland with a neighbor who thinks I'm on a business trip. The practicalities of resurrection were more complicated than the emotional ones.
Julian found himself in a federal holding room answering questions from investigators who were trying to untangle 3 years of false identity while verifying his story about witness protection. Through the process, his mind kept returning to Grace. Mrs. Chen would be expecting him back tomorrow. Grace would be asking about the family tree project, wondering if she could finally include the relatives she'd just learned existed. But those relatives were now grappling with their own crisis. Julian's revelation had shattered Amelia's defense, but created new legal tangles. The fraud charges remained, but the supposed victim was now present to testify. The insurance money had been obtained through false pretenses, but the person declared dead was alive to discuss it. Most complicated of all was the emotional reckoning. Julian had spent 3 years believing his disappearance was a sacrifice for Grace's safety. But watching Amelia's face in that courtroom, seeing the pain his choices had caused, he realized his protection had come at a cost he hadn't fully calculated. His sister had committed fraud, yes, but she had done it while genuinely grieving his loss, while fighting to preserve their parents' legacy, while carrying the weight of family responsibility he had abandoned. As evening approached and lawyers scrambled to file motions, Julian sat in his holding cell and finally understood the true price of his resurrection. It wasn't just about revealing himself or facing legal consequences. It was about accepting responsibility for all the choices that had led to this moment. His own, Amelia's, and the impossible decisions that families make when love and desperation collide. As evening approached and lawyers scrambled to file motions, Julian sat in his holding cell and finally understood the true price of his resurrection. The immediate chaos of his courtroom revelation had given way to the grinding machinery of legal process, but underneath it all was a more fundamental reckoning, with family, with truth, and with the choices that had brought them all to this moment.
The federal marshals had been surprisingly accommodating about his call to Portland. Mrs. Chen had listened to his carefully edited explanation, family emergency, delayed return, Grace could stay another night, with the patient understanding of someone who had raised her own children through various crises. But Julian knew that conversation with Grace couldn't be delayed much longer. How do you explain to a 4-year-old that her entire world was about to change, that the aunt she just learned existed was facing prison, that the quiet life they'd built was ending? The next morning brought James Park to Julian's holding cell, his expensive suit wrinkled from an all-nighter of legal research. The attorney's usual confidence had been replaced by the haggard determination of someone rebuilding a case from scratch. "Your resurrection creates interesting possibilities," Park said without preamble. The prosecution's case was built on fraud, obtaining money through false death claims. But if the supposed victim is alive and can testify about his sister's state of mind... Julian studied the lawyer who had spent weeks painting him as a troubled man driven to suicide. "You want me to help defend Amelia. I want to keep your sister out of federal prison. The question is whether you share that goal." The answer should have been simple. Amelia was family. She had committed fraud, yes, but she had done it while genuinely believing he was dead, while trying to save their parents' legacy. But Julian had learned that family loyalty was more complicated than simple blood connections. "I'll testify," Julian said, "but I won't lie. Not anymore." Park nodded as if he'd expected nothing else. "The truth might be enough. Your disappearance, your reasons for leaving, the danger you were fleeing, it all supports a narrative that Amelia genuinely believed you were gone." Over the following days, as lawyers negotiated and prosecutors reconsidered their case, Julian was allowed supervised visits with his family. The first was with Uncle Leonard, whose disappointment had hardened into something more complex. Grief mixed with relief, anger tempered by love. 40 years I've lived in this country," Leonard said, his voice carrying the weight of an immigrant's relationship with justice. 40 years of believing that if you followed the rules, worked hard, told the truth, you would be protected. And then my nephew disappears, my niece commits fraud, and I learned that the American dream sometimes requires lying to survive." Julian had no answer for that. Leonard's faith in the system had been one of the family's constants, and Julian's choices had shattered it as surely as they'd shattered everything else. The visit with Amelia was harder. She sat across from him in the federal building's visiting room, her hands folded carefully in her lap, studying his face as if memorizing it against another disappearance. "Tell me about Grace," she said finally. Julian pulled out his phone, showing pictures of his daughter, first steps, birthday parties, bedtime stories. Amelia studied each image with the intensity of someone trying to understand a language she'd never learned. "She looks like you did at that age. Same stubborn chin. Does she know about us now?" "Some of it, not all." Julian hesitated. "She's been asking about family for months. The school project about family trees, it broke her heart that she didn't have grandparents to draw." Amelia's composure finally cracked. "I would have loved her," she whispered, "if I'd known. Julian, I would have been the best aunt. I would have spoiled her rotten and taught her how to make dumplings and told her stories about our parents." "You still can." The words surprised Julian as much as they did Amelia, but as he spoke them, he realized they were true. Whatever legal consequences they all faced, Grace deserved to know her family. She deserved the messy complexity of extended relationships, the security of belonging to something larger than just him.
"The prosecutors are offering a plea deal," Amelia said, changing the subject. "Restitution, community service, probation. Park thinks it's because your testimony would make their fraud case much harder to prove." Julian nodded. He would testify that Amelia had genuinely believed he was dead, that her actions were motivated by grief and desperation rather than calculated greed. It was the truth, and it might be enough to keep his sister out of prison. "Isaac's already agreed to cooperate," Amelia continued. We're getting divorced. The guilt was destroying him, and now that you're alive..." She shrugged with forced casualness. "Some marriages don't survive resurrection." The legal resolution came 3 weeks later. Amelia pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for full restitution to the insurance company, 2 years of community service, and 5 years of probation. Isaac received a suspended sentence for his cooperation and testimony about the circumstances that led to their fraud. Uncle Leonard's house was saved when the insurance company agreed to a payment plan rather than demanding immediate full restitution. The restaurant survived under a management agreement that allowed Amelia to continue working there while ensuring financial oversight. But the most important negotiation happened in Portland, in Julian's apartment, with Grace sitting cross-legged on the floor while he tried to explain why their life was changing. "So, we're going to be Bennetts again?" she asked, trying out the sound of their real name. "Yes. And you're going to meet your Aunt Amelia, and your Uncle Leonard, and Margaret, who's like a grandmother." Grace considered this seriously. "Will they like me?" Julian knelt down beside her, remembering Amelia's words about being the best aunt, about teaching Grace to make dumplings and telling her family stories. "They're going to love you more than you can imagine." 6 months later, Julian stood in Bennett's kitchen watching Grace help Amelia fold wontons with the concentrated determination that only children brought to important tasks. Margaret sat nearby, offering gentle corrections and stories about Julian and Amelia's childhood attempts at the same task. Uncle Leonard emerged from the kitchen carrying a pot of tea, his movements careful but content. The federal case had aged him, but having Julian back, having Grace in their lives, had restored something that had been missing since their parents' death. "Not too much filling," Amelia instructed Grace patiently. "Just like this. Your daddy was terrible at this when he was little, always made them too fat." Grace giggled, completely absorbed in learning this new skill from the aunt she'd only known for a few months, but already adored. Watching them together, Julian felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple peace of belonging. The restaurant hummed with its usual evening energy, customers enjoying food that carried the weight of family history and immigrant dreams. The insurance money had been repaid, the legal consequences accepted, the family bonds rebuilt on foundations of truth rather than convenient fiction. Julian's witness protection arrangement had been officially terminated, his safety ensured through Victoria's recent arrest on unrelated federal charges. The danger that had driven him into hiding was finally over, though the scars from those years would always remain. As Grace carefully placed her first successful dumpling on the tray, she looked up at Julian with pride shining in her eyes. "Look, Daddy, I made it like a real Bennett." Julian smiled, understanding that she meant more than just the dumpling. She was learning to be part of something larger than their small family of two, learning the complicated joy of extended relationships and shared history. The restaurant's evening rush continued around them, but Julian felt suspended in this moment, watching his daughter learn family recipes from the sister he'd thought lost forever, surrounded by the love he'd abandoned in his quest for safety. Resurrection, Julian realized, wasn't just about returning from the dead. It was about accepting that some things, family, truth, belonging, were worth the risk of being fully alive.